Hi everyone, after that slightly delayed start, for which I apologise. Welcome to the consumer identity track here. I'm not sure if you plan on attending all the sessions, but there's 6 in total. 6 fantastic speakers, equally fantastic presentations. I've had the pleasure of talking through each of them over the last couple of weeks. And if I were you, I would stay here and listen to all of them, but I appreciate there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. My job today is to make sure it runs smoothly, so I've failed already. Mostly what I'm going to do is stay out of the way. You don't need to know anything about me or who I am, but I do want to introduce Nishant Kaushik, who is going to give one of the more interesting talks that I've seen so far, in the sense that I've spent some time on calls with him. I've seen all of his slides. I'm still not entirely sure what he's going to say, but I shall look forward, as you will, to hearing his speech. Nishant.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm going to try and power through this and try and catch up. That's going to be a little difficult. I'm the CTO of Uniken. As a little bit of background for this talk, I've been in the enterprise identity management space for a long time, in startups, in big companies like Oracle and CA. And recently, over the last few years, I've been increasingly in the consumer identity space. So that shift from enterprise identity management to consumer identity is sort of the genesis for this talk. So a quick show of hands, how many people here have worked on enterprise identity management? Okay. So how many of you, when you were doing whatever you were doing, when you're dealing with employees, partners, et cetera, whether it was authentication, provisioning, whatever, how many of you, as part of your requirements, was focused on App Store ratings? Anybody? It's just not something we do, right? It's not part of our DNA. I've been in these meetings where there was this one meeting in particular where I went to where the focus of the discussion was going to be about enabling federation with partners and clients on the mobile device, right? And I was prepared. I went in prepared to talk about app auth and how web views were not going to be used anymore and how we needed to do token binding. And we got to none of that because the entire conversation was around how mobile federation was going to create bad App Store ratings. We spent the entire talk talking about that, right? And it was a little bit eye-opening, right? I mean, in security, we've kind of had this moment now where we've all come to understand that usability is part of what we need to do. We need to be focusing on usability and security. It's an important imperative, right? We all understand this. And even though we have had this moment of enlightenment, when we start thinking about it in the enterprise and consumer space, we're still not agreeing. There's still not the same level of understanding about what we mean by usability. There's still a disconnect. And that's primarily because when we're thinking about the enterprise IAM use case, we think about usability as disgruntled employees, people grumbling, calls to the IT, help desk, et cetera. In consumer identity, when you're thinking about usability, you're thinking about abandoned shopping carts. You're thinking about loss of business. It's a fairly different approach. And there's a big gap in how we think about usability in that context. So Stranger in a Strange Land, if anybody's read the work by Robert Heinlein, it's about this gentleman called Michael Valentine Smith, who is a human born and brought up on Mars, brought up entirely by Martians. And his first encounter with human beings is when he's brought back to Earth as an adult. And when he's back, he's got this very Martian way of thinking. And to him, humans are beautiful, complex, chaotic, completely alien to him. He just doesn't understand the way they think. Or as he puts it, he just cannot grok them. That's where the word grok originated, right? He just cannot grok human beings. And that's kind of how I felt when I started going into the world of consumer identity. A more appropriate one for me personally was I found myself in those meetings, especially that meeting on Mobile Federation, sitting there, channeling Leonard Nimoy, raising my eyebrow and constantly going, fascinating. Like, just don't see it. And as I went deeper and deeper into the problem, and I started to understand where the disconnects lay, I started to understand that this wasn't a problem about technology. It wasn't a problem about standards not being where they needed to be or standards not being implemented correctly. It wasn't even necessarily a problem about the technology not being available to us, but it was really a question of wiring. It was a way we are wired to think, the way we are wired to think as enterprise IAM architects, as enterprise IAM project managers and product managers, and the way we think as not just us, but also how enterprise users are wired to think, how they have been trained to think, and how consumer identity, when we're talking about consumers, how not only are they wired to think, but how their wiring actually constantly evolves, something that doesn't necessarily happen on the enterprise side. And this whole notion of rewiring the brain really stuck with me because back in the day when I was at Identitropy and building this identity as a service platform, that was my first encounter with this notion of having to rewire my brain. And that was because I encountered this young gentleman called Omi, who's sitting right there, and 6 years later, he still looks like a young kid. But whenever I picture him, I picture this. Because he introduced me to that earworm, what does the fox say? Like, it's his fault. I blame him for that. But I also blame him for getting this thing into my head about not sort of rewiring your brain to think about the use cases and not sticking with the things that we've stuck with before, right? He was focused on UX, but he didn't just challenge me on basic stuff, like things like number of clicks or how to design a form to be the optimally placed, organized form for a user flow. He fundamentally challenged my assumptions about why do we need a form in the first place? Why do we need this stuff? Like, he was fundamentally challenging my assumptions. And assumptions is the first thing that I want to talk about, because that's literally sort of at the core of what we do with enterprise identity management is we start with a whole set of assumptions. We're like these mathematical geniuses who are building out these mathematical formulas, and we have all these prerequisites, right? We make all these prerequisites. The technology has to work a certain way. Users' behavior has to be a certain way. We make assumptions about the user behaviors and motivations when we approach it. And those assumptions literally inform the way we deploy the product. We expect users to adopt the product a certain way. We expect them to have a certain set of technology. If they don't have it, we will give it to them, right? So when things don't work the way we want them to work, we expect the user, the enterprise user, to adapt to the dictate of the business, right? That's basically the way we work in our enterprise identity management. The other thing we do in enterprise identity management is we're absolutists. We believe in absolute concepts, right? Things must work a certain way. You have a narrow range of deviation within which technology operates, within which users operate, and if anything goes beyond that, well, reboot and try again, right? That's almost always our approach. If you have a problem, call the help desk. And we assume all of our users are exactly the same, right? I'm not talking about roles and stuff here, but essentially all our users are treated to be exactly the same. They all look alike, they all behave alike, the motivations, et cetera, the same. But when you go to consumer identity, we're dealing with a mass of chaos. We're dealing with completely different kinds of people, different levels of technology savviness, different motivations and assumptions and behaviors. They're all completely different. And what we really need to embrace is this notion of flexibility, right? That's the big transition, because assumption and absolutism basically creates very rigid systems. These rigid systems are really easy for us to manage and maintain and build, but they are also very fragile. They break apart the minute we deviate from assumptions. The most glaring example of that has been the BYOD phenomenon, right? The minute BYOD came into the picture, all of a sudden, all these things that we had built from an enterprise security standpoint, all of a sudden stopped working, and we had to redo our entire architectures to embrace BYOD. And flexibility means you need to build a system that bends but doesn't break. It means instead of having the user adapt to the business, we need the business to adapt to the user and the multiple users, the different kinds of users, the different personas that exist. And so what does it mean to embrace a flexible mindset? So those are some of the things that I want to talk about today. The first is the notion of choice. We have to be able to give end users choices, because we cannot make assumptions about those users. We cannot make assumptions about what technology they have. We cannot make assumptions about how they're going to operate, when they operate. Those choices are important to them. The second piece is the notion of adaptive. We talk a lot about adaptive in identity management, right? Adaptive authentication. Mostly that's about having the processes and the mechanisms adapt to the nature or the risk that exists to the business. The risk changes, you adapt the mechanism to the risk. What about adapting to the user? We don't really think about what it means to adapt to the user, where they are in their journey as a consumer of your service. We don't adapt the security that we're providing them to whether they're a new user, whether they're a long-time user, whether they're a novice user, whether they're a power user. We don't necessarily think about adaptation from a user perspective. We think about it from risk, but we don't really think about it from a user perspective. Another buzzword, intelligence, is the theme of the conference. We just heard Patrick talking about it. Again, intelligence, usually used in the context of business analytics or risk analytics, measuring risk, using behavior analytics to understand and predict what will happen. But what about applying intelligence to how we treat the user? What intelligent behavior by the system, where the system learns not only the user, but their needs, their usage, and adapts to that, uses the intelligence to basically mold the experience to the user state. That it's not even advanced. It doesn't require AI. It doesn't necessarily require machine learning. It's just basic common sense, basic intelligence, but we don't necessarily use that when we're designing our systems. We have this single path flow, and we basically say, here's the positive path. We write all our design specs around that. Maybe we spend a little bit of time around exception flows, but we don't really think about the myriads of ways in which users can go over. One of the things we need to do when we go into consumer space as identity professionals is embrace the obsession that consumer services have with metrics, the obsession they have with customer validation. We don't do that a lot in security. We don't do that as enterprise IAM users. When was the last time when we're building out a new process, we went out and did customer validation where we tested the use case with end users in the real world, did the testing, instrumented our processes to understand how those choices are being leveraged in production by users, understanding the choices where they're making, where they're falling down, and using that information to change our processes, change our technology in adapting it to the needs that we have. One of the things that we don't think about enough between enterprise and consumer is a big difference is the call center. In the enterprise, when things don't work, and invariably they do happen, enterprise users raise tickets, you call up the help desk, you may just walk across the room and go bang on the IT department's door, right? Just tell them to fix it, right? The call center in the enterprise, the help desk exists, but in the consumer world, the call center is anathema, right? The call center is something to be feared in consumer because even a few calls to the call center can eliminate any margin you're making on a consumer. And so all the processes, all the designs in the consumer identity space have to be built around this notion of deviating away from a call center model, minimizing the calls to the call center. And there's this, I think Alex Stamos, who's the CISO of Facebook, had this really interesting exchange on Twitter a few weeks ago, I think, where somebody was complaining about the way that two-factor authentication in Facebook is set up. And the fact that after you've set up two-factor authentication, you can continue to log in without enabling two-factor authentication, and can actually disable two-factor authentication without ever using the two-factor authentication. And somebody was complaining that this is bad security. This is the kind of stuff that people shouldn't be doing, especially Facebook. And he had a whole discussion about, yes, but that's a very purist approach. That's the absolutist approach. Think about how you deal with these problems at a billion user scale, right? If you have, and you're dealing with all these different kinds of users who may turn on two-factor authentication but don't necessarily know how to use it. They're not professionals, ID professionals like us who understand two-factor authentication, so they're invariably going to make mistakes. They're invariably going to get locked out. How do you handle that? You need to give them this grace period. That was this notion. And the idea of scaling businesses to billion users, impacting the processes, impacting the way that we deploy our security. Privacy. Privacy is obviously something we all care about, but in the enterprise space, we don't really think about it. When we build our systems, admins have full access. They can go in, and by design, in fact, we give them full access to be able to go in, look at the data, fix the data, go in and make changes. In enterprise, there's this notion of the trust within the admin space and the ops space that you cannot afford in the consumer space, because in the consumer space, you're dealing with very sensitive information. So you have to pay attention to privacy by design, because with the identity information that exists, you can do a lot of harm. So as Ian said, as you just heard him say, we have to de-weaponize our identity systems, which is extremely important in the consumer space where that identity data can be used for bad, right? You've heard the use cases of operators using the data to stalk ex-girlfriends or go after reporters that they have a beef with. There's a lot of harm that you can do to an end user with the data that's available to you. And even if you're just using it for laughs, there's a need for us as identity professionals to understand that privacy has to be built in not just at the front end in terms of how you're dealing with the user, but also on the back end. When you're thinking of your admins, when you're thinking of who has access to the core data, even if they're going straight to the database. And that goes hand in hand with the notion of the algorithms and the intelligence-based systems that we're building. We're increasingly relying on machine learning and artificial intelligence in our systems, and there's this whole notion that they'll make security better, which they probably will. They definitely will. But accompanying that is, when we think about de-weaponizing identity systems, is this notion of algorithmic accountability. It's not something we talk a lot about when we think about identity management and we think about the way we're evolving our security systems. Without a notion of algorithmic accountability and understanding how the algorithms operate, inherently our biases that exist will make their way into the algorithms. And they will inherently always disadvantage the people who are at the fringes of our user models, right? When we think about not making assumptions, those assumptions that we typically make always cater to our notion of who the user is. And we have this very narrow view. As hard as we can try, biases will always enter into the picture. And without algorithmic accountability, you don't have the ability to address that. You don't have the ability to fix your systems as you're going along in order to not disadvantage people who are on the fringes of your use cases. So those are some of the ideas that you have to think through when you're thinking about introducing flexibility into the architecture. So I want to talk a little bit about how this mind shift applies a little bit. And I want to take a use case that we're all familiar with, authentication, and more specifically two-factor authentication. There was a big push a few years ago, I think everybody was aware when it was happening, that there was this whole notion of everything has to be two-factor. There was an increase in data breaches, so every service, every consumer service was being asked, why don't you have two-factor? There were blogs being written about it, including by experts like me, and there were sites that were actually tracking which consumer services had turned on two-factor and which ones hadn't. Like, it was a big deal at the time. And obviously, what that created was this push towards using SMS-based OTPs as the second factor, right? Myself including, a bunch of people were talking about how it was just so easy to turn on SMS-based OTP because you had services like Twilio that allowed you to just do it as a simple API call, so you didn't have to even think about it. It wasn't an expensive thing to add. Well, fast forward a few years later, and now SMS-based OTP is the new password. And what I mean by that is that it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. It's not as secure as we thought it was. It has issues, and there are calls to kill it. You know, us in the identity management community love killing off stuff. There has to be something we're killing off at every conference. So there's calls to kill off SMS-based OTP. And you know, I've been an absolutist in my calls, in very vocal calls, about forcing people to shift off SMS-based OTP. NIST obviously put out their recommendation that nobody should be using it. But as I went into the consumer identity world, and I started to realize that whole notion of this broad approach that you need, and I started to realize that you can't necessarily give up something just because it has certain issues. You need to have a more pragmatic approach. How do you deal in a world where a lot of users are accessing your services from a library computer, right? Where they don't have smartphones, where they may have shared devices, or they may be having a shared email a family email account, right? You have to understand those kind of use cases and adapt your solution to that. And the rush to add two-factor authentication resulted in this notion of everybody saying, okay, fine, we've added two-factor, and people saying, well, two-factor SMS-based OTP isn't good enough, so add additional ones. So we're adding more, we're adding authenticator apps, we're adding YubiKeys, all good stuff. But again, this notion of, well, so just add all of them and let the user deal with it, basically means that you now have users, and I'm certainly one of them, where on multiple services, I now can have two-factor either based on SMS OTP or based on my authenticator app and so on. And the thing to remember here is, when you have these many choices and you're leaving it up to the user, your authentication is only as strong as the weakest one in the link. So it doesn't really matter that I've added an authenticator app. When I recently tried to shift I started using my accounts on a burner phone that I had because of some travel I was going to make, and I tried to sign on to Twitter, it sent me an SMS OTP, even though I had set up my authenticator app. And I was frustrated and annoyed, and I tried to go to use other services, and it was a repeated pattern. Everybody, even though I'd set up my authenticator app, they still send me the SMS-based OTP. And there was no way we would take it out, because if I actually tried to remove my mobile number, it said, you must have a mobile number in order to use two-factor authentication. So I was kind of stuck. And the fact of the matter is that we have many ways of getting around the stronger layers of security we put in. I've written extensively on my blog about account recovery as the biggest problem we have to deal with, because our account recovery processes typically don't use any of those factors. The whole point is my factor's not working, I need to get around it. So you may have strong, YubiKeys associated, but if your forgot my password process relies on plain old simple KBA, how easy is it for an attacker to get around this security model that you've built because you've got this one weak spot in your security architecture? So I'm going to use this sort of mindset that I was describing to sort of tackle the problem a little bit and sort of illustrate the point through a blueprint approach. So if we start with this notion of the user, and if you have a user, if you're building a service around a user that is always smartphone, if you're building it for a mobile-first world, then there are solutions that give you omnichannel use cases, all the stuff about good stuff about zero login, et cetera. They all work great. But more likely than not, if you're building a consumer use case, you're building it for this guy who is a basic user, not very technical, not very smart. We all assume that he doesn't really know much. And you can't make any assumptions about the technology he has. So usually you're going to give him this. You're going to give him a username password model, maybe some social login, and that's all he needs to do. And after a while, you try to say, okay, you need to turn on two-factor authentication, so you add SMS-based OTP. You don't make it mandatory, so it's up to the user to decide. And for the most part, this is okay. For most users, in most consumer services, I'm not talking about banking apps, obviously, I'm talking about most consumer services, this is okay because it's a very pragmatic approach. The vast majority of users are not high-value targets. They're not going to get tackled that way. But you also want to try and educate them and try to get them to turn it on. But as a business, what you want to do is look at this and start bringing in some notion, as I was talking about earlier, about how about making the systems intelligent in terms of understanding the behavior. So maybe what you do is you build some model where you try to build a notion of how do I evaluate the value of a user, the value of this user in terms of the damage that could be done to them if they don't have the right set of security. So maybe they go from being Brian to being someone like Paul, who has reached a certain value because he has a certain number of users. People pay attention to him. Maybe it's a user who has achieved a certain number of reward points in your reward program. So that reward points is cash, it's currency, and it needs to be protected. So for those users, you can tell them, for you now, two-factor authentication is mandatory. And if you educate the user as to the value they're getting out of security, they will adopt security. This has been proven out by multiple studies that most users essentially don't follow security edicts because of the fact that they understand the security. They are trying to do a correlation between the level of security and inconvenience that they're getting and matching it to the value that they perceive, the security risk that they perceive. It's not an actual security risk, it's what their perception is. And if you explain this to the user, they'll typically see it and they'll be able to do it. So you adapt the behavior to say, okay, you've reached a certain point, you need to have two-factor as a mandatory environment. And then you give them the choice. You give them the choice to add stronger factors of authentication to their account. And obviously, power users tend to go for this. Geeks like us tend to go for this. A lot of users won't. But as you progress and you adapt, you basically understand from an adaptive perspective that once they've started to use it, you give them some grace period. You say, okay, let's see if you do instrumentation. You measure. Are they using the stronger authentication token? Are they using that consistently? Have they been having failures? And when you see that they've consistently started to use it successfully, you phase out the old one. You get rid of the SMS-based OTP, or at least you disable it as a second factor that they use typically. Maybe you move it into their account recovery process. The other thing you do is you look at, again, a user who's turned on SMS-based OTP and is not really using it, but they haven't necessarily made the choices. But you have this behavior analytics that you have in there that you're using to gather. We're all adopting behavior analytics to gather information about the users, and you can use that to see, well, he has a smartphone, so push him, send note messages, use this app instead, incentivize them to use the secondary app, actually use the behavioral analytics that you're gathering, not just to do risk assessment, but actually inform how you interact with the user and actually help them make better choices, in this case, adopting a stronger factor. And then pay attention to your account recovery processes. Use those second factors maybe for, instead of as a primary second factor, but push them into your account recovery process. So keep the SMS OTP in there, But combine that with another factor, like, for example, transaction-based KBA that you can use, because you want to make sure that the account recovery process has the same level of strength that goes along with your initial factors. You don't want the account recovery to be a weaker credential, because then, like I said, it's an easier way to get around. And one of the things that I've been talking about recently is if you have a consumer service that has this notion of relationships in it, then use relationship-based account recovery. It's a really interesting idea that can be used without limitation, without being restricted by the technology choices that the user may be making, where you can rely on trusted relationships. Facebook has a little bit of a notion of this. They don't go quite far enough. But as we're building more and more concepts of relationship and identity relationship management into our services, we can do this. So in summary, shift your wiring to start thinking about choice, being able to adapt the behavior of the systems, making them more intelligent, adding more metrics and customer validation to the process. Make sure you do privacy by design and bring in some algorithmic accountability. So with that, I thank you. And I don't know if you have time for questions.